The Bellingham house had stood on Maple Ridge Lane for 47 years, and for every single one of those years, Dorothy Calloway had been the one to keep it standing. She painted the shutters herself every spring, a soft ivory white that caught the morning light just right. She replaced the porch boards when they warped. She mended the screen door when the hinges gave out after a bad storm in the summer of '91. And when her husband Frank passed away in 2004, she kept the house exactly the way he would have wanted it, not as a shrine but as a living, breathing place where every room still felt like someone cared. Dorothy was 81 years old the morning her children arrived unannounced. She had been sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea, watching a cardinal land on the bird feeder outside the window, when the front door opened without a knock. She heard the familiar click of Janine's heels on the hardwood floor, followed by the heavier shuffle of her son Martin's boots. A third set of footsteps followed, lighter and unfamiliar. Janine appeared in the kitchen doorway first. She was 53, dressed sharply in a dark blazer and pressed slacks, her auburn hair pulled tight behind her ears. Martin stood behind her, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his eyes fixed somewhere on the floor. He was 49 but looked older, the kind of tired that settles into a man who has stopped caring about the details of his own life. The third person was a woman Dorothy had never met. She carried a leather folder and wore a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mom," Janine said, pulling out the chair across from Dorothy and sitting down without being invited. "We need to talk." Dorothy set her tea down slowly. She had learned many years ago to read the weather in her daughter's voice, and this was not a conversation. This was a verdict. "This is Linda Marsh," Janine continued, gesturing toward the woman with the folder. "She's a placement coordinator with Meadow Glen Assisted Living." Dorothy looked at the woman, then back at Janine. "A placement coordinator," she repeated quietly. Martin cleared his throat from the doorway. "Mom, it's not what you think." "Then what is it, Martin?" Janine leaned forward. "You're 81. You live alone. The house is too much for you." "The house is fine." "The house needs a new roof," Janine said firmly. "The plumbing backs up every winter. The furnace is 20 years old. And last month, Mrs. Draper from across the street called me to say she saw you standing in the driveway at 2 in the morning in your robe." Dorothy felt the heat rise to her face. She had gone outside that night because she heard something in the yard, a raccoon probably, knocking over the garbage can. She had dealt with it herself the way she had dealt with everything herself for the last 19 years. But she knew how it must have looked to Helen Draper, who had nothing better to do than watch from behind her curtains. "I was checking on something," Dorothy said. "I went right back inside." "That's not the point," Janine said. "The point is you can't keep doing this alone." Linda Marsh opened her leather folder and slid a glossy brochure across the kitchen table. On the front was a photograph of smiling elderly people sitting in a sunlit common room, holding cups of coffee and looking like they had been arranged there by a photographer, which of course they had. "Meadow Glen is a wonderful community," Linda said warmly. "Private rooms, meal plans, medical staff on site 24 hours a day." Dorothy did not touch the brochure. She looked at Martin. "Is this what you want?" she asked. Martin's jaw tightened. He still would not meet her eyes. "I think it makes sense," he said. "Janine and I talked about it." "You talked about it," Dorothy said. "Without me?" "Because we knew you'd say no," Janine said. "And that didn't tell you something?" The kitchen went quiet. The cardinal outside had flown away. Dorothy's tea was getting cold. She wrapped both hands around the cup anyway, needing something to hold. What Janine did not say, what neither of her children would ever say plainly, was the truth Dorothy had understood for months. They wanted the house. Not because they loved it. Not because they had memories here worth preserving. They wanted to sell it. The property on Maple Ridge Lane sat on nearly 2 acres of land in a neighborhood that had been rezoned for mixed-use development 3 years earlier. A developer had already made inquiries. Dorothy knew this because Martin had accidentally forwarded her an email 6 months ago that was clearly meant for Janine. The subject line read property valuation update. The number at the bottom of the message was $780,000. That was the number her home was worth to her children. Not the 47 years. Not the shutters she painted every spring. Not the kitchen where she had taught both of them to crack eggs without getting shell in the bowl. $780,000. 3 weeks later, Dorothy Calloway moved out of the house on Maple Ridge Lane. She did not fight it. She had considered calling a lawyer, had even picked up the phone once, but the truth was that fighting would have meant fighting her own children, and Dorothy did not have the kind of anger that could sustain a war against the people she had raised. So she packed what she could. A few boxes of photographs. Her sewing kit. Frank's old wool cardigan that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco if she pressed her face into the collar. A small ceramic bird that had sat on the kitchen windowsill for as long as she could remember. Everything else, the furniture, the dishes, the curtains she had sewn by hand, all of it stayed behind. Janine had told her the assisted living room was furnished, and that there would be no space for large personal items. The room at Meadow Glen was clean and small. A single bed with a thin mattress, a nightstand, a narrow closet, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot. The walls were beige. The floor was linoleum. A small television sat on a shelf bolted to the wall. Dorothy stood in the center of the room with her 3 boxes stacked beside her and felt something close in her chest that she could not name. It was not sadness exactly. It was smaller than that and sharper. It was the feeling of being folded up and put away. She placed the ceramic bird on the windowsill. It looked out of place. Everything here looked out of place, including her. The first month at Meadow Glen passed slowly. Dorothy ate her meals in the communal dining room, where the food was bland and overcooked and served on plastic trays. She attended a craft session once, but the instructor spoke to the residents the way a kindergarten teacher speaks to children, and Dorothy quietly excused herself after 20 minutes. There was one woman at Meadow Glen who did not seem to belong there either. Her name was Ruth, and she sat at the same table in the dining room every morning, drinking black coffee and reading the newspaper with a pen in her hand, circling things, and writing notes in the margins the way someone does when they still believe the world is worth paying attention to. Ruth was 86 and had been a schoolteacher for 40 years. Her daughter had placed her at Meadow Glen after Ruth fell in the kitchen and fractured her wrist. The wrist had healed 4 months ago, but Ruth was still here. "They don't let you leave once they've decided you can't manage," Ruth told Dorothy one morning over coffee. "It's not a lock on the door. It's a lock on the conversation. They stop asking what you want and start telling you what's best." Dorothy looked at Ruth and recognized something in her eyes. Not defeat, but the careful, measured stillness of a woman conserving her strength for something she had not yet decided on. "Have you thought about leaving?" Dorothy asked. Ruth smiled faintly. "Every single day." "Then why haven't you?" "Because I don't have anywhere to go," Ruth said. She set down her coffee cup and looked out the window at the parking lot. "That's the part they count on." Dorothy thought about that conversation for days afterward. She thought about it when she lay in her narrow bed at night listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights in the hallway. She thought about it when she watched the other residents shuffle between meals and activity rooms like passengers on a train that had stopped making stops. And she thought about it when she realized that Ruth was right. The lock was not on the door. The lock was on the belief that there was nothing left on the other side. She called Martin twice. The first time, he answered and told her he was busy but would call back. He did not call back. The second time, his phone went to voicemail. She did not leave a message. Janine called once, briefly, to let her know that the house had been listed for sale. "We got an offer already," she said brightly. "Above asking." Dorothy said nothing. "Mom, are you there?" "I'm here," Dorothy said. "It's a good thing," Janine said. "Now you don't have to worry about any of it." After they hung up, Dorothy sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the parking lot through the window. A delivery truck was backing into a loading bay. The beeping echoed off the walls. She had not told her children about the other property. She had not told anyone, because until this moment, she had almost forgotten it herself. The property had belonged to her mother, Evelyn Pruitt, who had died in 1986. It was a farmhouse on the outskirts of a town called Harlow Creek, about 4 hours south of the city, deep in the rural stretch of the state where the roads turned to gravel and the nearest neighbor was a mile away. Dorothy had been there only once, as a young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old. She remembered the smell of hay and old wood. She remembered a long stone wall and a heavy wooden door that led somewhere underground. She remembered her mother pulling her away from that door firmly and saying, "That part of the house is not for us." After Evelyn passed, the farmhouse had gone into a trust that no one ever touched. Taxes had been paid automatically through a small account Evelyn had set up decades earlier. The property simply existed, untouched, unvisited, slowly being swallowed by the countryside. Dorothy had found the deed 2 years ago while sorting through a box of her mother's old papers. A yellowed envelope containing a single document and a small iron key. On the back of the deed, in her mother's careful handwriting, were the words, "For Dorothy, when she is ready." She had not been ready then. She was not sure she was ready now. But as she sat on the edge of her thin mattress in a room that smelled like industrial cleaner, she realized something that settled over her like a coat finally pulled from a closet. She had nowhere else to go. And she had a key. The morning she left, Dorothy stopped by Ruth's room. The door was open. Ruth was sitting in her chair by the window, pen in hand, newspaper spread across her lap. "I'm leaving," Dorothy said. Ruth looked up. She studied Dorothy for a moment, the way a teacher studies a student who has just answered a question no one else could. "Good," Ruth said. "Don't come back." Dorothy smiled. It was the first real smile she had felt in weeks. "I won't," she said. It took Dorothy 11 days to arrange her departure from Meadow Glen. She did not tell Janine or Martin. She signed the voluntary discharge paperwork herself, citing her legal right to leave as a self-admitted resident. The staff tried to talk her out of it. The floor nurse, a kind woman named Patricia, sat with her for 20 minutes. "Mrs. Calloway, do you have someone who can look after you?" "I have looked after myself for 19 years, Dorothy said. "I expect I can manage a few more." Patricia studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You have my number if you ever need anything." Dorothy packed her 3 boxes into the trunk of a taxi and gave the driver the address she had written on a slip of paper. It was a long drive, nearly 4.5 hours, and the fare would take most of the small savings she had left. But Dorothy sat in the back seat with the iron key resting in her palm and watched the city shrink behind her. The highway gave way to county roads. The county roads gave way to gravel. The gravel gave way to a dirt path lined with overgrown maple trees whose bare branches arched overhead like the ribs of some ancient cathedral. And then the farmhouse appeared. It was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply been smaller the last time she saw it. The structure was built from pale stone and dark timber, 2 stories, with a steep roof and a chimney that listed slightly to the left. The front porch had partially collapsed on one side, and ivy had overtaken the eastern wall so completely that it looked like the house was being slowly pulled back into the earth. But the bones were there. Dorothy could see that immediately. The stone walls were thick and solid. The windows, though clouded with decades of grime, were intact. The front door, made of heavy oak, still hung squarely in its frame. The taxi driver helped her carry her boxes to the porch. He looked at the house, then at Dorothy, and his expression was the kind that people wear when they want to say something but know it is not their place. "You going to be all right out here?" he asked. "I believe so," Dorothy said. He nodded uncertainly, got back in the car, and drove away. The sound of the engine faded down the dirt road until it was gone entirely, and then there was only silence. Dorothy stood on the broken porch with the iron key in her hand and looked at the farmhouse her mother had left for her. The wind moved through the bare trees. A crow called from somewhere in the distance. The sky was pale gray and enormous. She slid the key into the front door lock. It resisted for a moment, the mechanism stiff with age. And then it turned with a deep, solid click that seemed to echo through the whole house. The door swung inward. The air inside was cold and still, heavy with the smell of dust and something older, something that reminded Dorothy of the way her mother's closet used to smell when she was a child. Cedar and dried lavender in time. The front room was modest. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened with the ghosts of old fires. A wooden rocking chair sat beside it, draped with a quilt so faded its pattern had become suggestions of color rather than color itself. Shelves lined the opposite wall, filled with glass jars, old books, and small ceramic figures covered in dust. Dorothy set her boxes down and walked slowly through the house. The kitchen was narrow but functional, with a cast-iron stove, a deep farmhouse sink, and a wooden table built for two. Upstairs, two small bedrooms sat beneath the sloping roof, each with a single window overlooking the overgrown fields behind the house. Everything was exactly as it must have been decades ago. No one had come here. No one had touched anything. The house had simply been waiting. Dorothy returned to the front room and sat down in the rocking chair. The quilt beneath her was thin and fragile, and the chair creaked with a sound so familiar it made her breath catch. She had heard that sound before. Somewhere deep in her memory, her mother had rocked in this very chair. She looked around the quiet room and felt something she had not felt in months. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but the absence of the weight that had been pressing down on her since the morning Janine walked into her kitchen with a woman carrying a leather folder. Here, in this forgotten house at the end of a dirt road, no one was telling her she was too old. No one was calculating her worth in square footage and market value. No one was folding her up and putting her away. Dorothy pulled Frank's old cardigan from the nearest box and draped it over her shoulders. She placed the ceramic bird on the mantel above the fireplace. Then she sat back in the rocking chair, listening to the wind press against the old stone walls, and let herself breathe. The first 3 days at the farmhouse were the hardest. The electricity had been disconnected years ago, and the water pump behind the house needed priming before it would produce anything more than a rusty cough. Dorothy spent the first night wrapped in every blanket she could find, sleeping in the rocking chair by the fireplace because the upstairs bedrooms were too cold without heat. But she was not helpless, and she refused to behave as though she were. By the second morning, she had figured out the water pump. By the third, she had arranged for a local utility company to restore power to the property. A man named Dale from the electric company drove out in a white truck, looked at the farmhouse, and scratched his head. "You planning to stay here?" he asked, the same careful tone the taxi driver had used. "I am staying here," Dorothy said. There was a difference, and she wanted him to hear it. Dale reconnected the power that afternoon. When the lights came on for the first time, casting a warm glow through the dusty rooms, Dorothy stood in the kitchen and felt a small, fierce satisfaction. That evening, she walked the property for the first time. The farmhouse sat on just over 6 acres of land, most of it overgrown meadow bordered by a crumbling stone wall. Behind the house, a weathered barn leaned against the hillside, its doors chained shut with a rusted padlock. Beyond the barn, a path disappeared into a stand of old oak trees. But it was the stone wall that held Dorothy's attention. It ran along the eastern edge of the property, thick and deliberately built, the kind of wall that had taken someone's serious labor to construct. And near the far end of the wall, partially hidden by decades of wild blackberry bramble, Dorothy noticed something she had not expected. A door. Set directly into the hillside behind the stone wall. Heavy timber framed in iron, with a rusted latch and a padlock so corroded it had fused into a single mass of orange metal. Dorothy stood before it for a long time. The bramble had grown so thick around the frame that the door was barely visible unless she were standing directly in front of it. Someone had sealed this entrance deliberately. Not just locked it, but buried it behind years of neglect that felt almost intentional, as if the land itself had been asked to keep a secret. She reached out and touched the iron frame. The metal was ice-cold beneath her fingertips. Somewhere in the back of her memory, she heard her mother's voice again, steady and firm, the way Evelyn always sounded when she meant something absolutely. "That part of the house is not for us." Dorothy pulled her hand back slowly. Not for us. But her mother had left her the key and the deed and a note that said, when she is ready. Dorothy looked at the sealed door in the hillside, then back at the farmhouse behind her, its windows now glowing faintly in the fading light. She was not ready yet. But she was closer than she had ever been. The weeks that followed moved slowly, the way time does when every hour is filled with work that matters. Dorothy fell into a rhythm she had not known she was capable of at 81. She woke before dawn, made tea on the old cast-iron stove, and spent the mornings cleaning one room at a time. She scrubbed the kitchen floor on her hands and knees until the original tile showed through decades of grime. She washed every window with vinegar and old newspaper until the light came through clean and honest. She beat the dust from the curtains and hung them back up, watching them sway gently in the draft from the cracked window frames. The work was hard. Her knees ached. Her back tightened by midday, and some evenings she sat in the rocking chair too exhausted to eat. But there was something in the effort that fed her in a way the dining room at Meadow Glen never had. Every clean surface, every repaired hinge, every swept corner was proof that she was still here. Still capable. Still worth the space she occupied. One evening, after a long day of scraping old paint from the window frames, Dorothy sat in the rocking chair and felt the doubt settle over her like cold air through a cracked door. Her hands were raw and swollen at the knuckles. Her lower back sent a sharp pain up her spine every time she shifted her weight. The farmhouse was quiet around her, and for the first time since arriving, the silence felt less like peace and more like loneliness. She picked up the phone and dialed Martin's number. It rang 5 times and went to voicemail. She hung up without leaving a message. She dialed Janine's number next. It rang twice before going straight to voicemail, the kind of quick redirect that means someone looked at the screen and chose not to answer. Dorothy set the phone down on the table and stared at it for a long time. Then she pulled Frank's cardigan tighter around her shoulders and spoke to the empty room. "I'm not going back," she said. Her voice sounded smaller than she expected. So she said it again, louder. "I am not going back." The rocking chair creaked beneath her. The fire in the stove popped softly. And the doubt, which had felt so heavy a moment ago, began to loosen its grip. Not because it was gone, but because she had spoken over it. The nearest town was Harlow Creek, a small cluster of buildings about 7 miles down the gravel road. A general store, a post office, a diner with a hand-painted sign that read Maze, and a small church with a white steeple that leaned slightly eastward. Dorothy drove there in the old pickup truck she had found in the barn, a 1978 Ford that had taken 3 days of coaxing before the engine finally turned over. The truck smelled like motor oil and hay, and the passenger seat was held together with duct tape, but it ran. The first time Dorothy walked into the general store, the woman behind the counter studied her with open curiosity. She was somewhere in her 60s, heavy-set, with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose and a pencil tucked behind her ear. "You're out at the Pruitt place," the woman said. It was not a question. "I am," Dorothy said. "Didn't know anyone was left in that family." "Just me." The woman extended her hand. "I'm B. Cochran. My husband's family has been in Harlow Creek since before the war." Dorothy shook her hand. "Dorothy Calloway. Evelyn Pruitt was my mother." Ba's expression shifted. Something flickered behind her eyes, not surprise exactly, but recognition. The kind of look a person wears when a piece of old gossip suddenly becomes relevant again. "Your mother," B said slowly. "Well, I'll be." Dorothy waited, but B did not elaborate. She rang up Dorothy's groceries in silence, and when Dorothy turned to leave, B spoke again. "That property has been sitting empty a long time, Mrs. Calloway. Folks around here figured it would just fall in on itself eventually." "It hasn't fallen yet," Dorothy said. B gave a small nod, the kind that carries respect even when the person giving it is not entirely sure it is earned yet. The second time Dorothy visited the general store, B was warmer. She had set aside a bag of local apples from a farm down the road and pushed them across the counter without ringing them up. "My husband's mother used to trade apples with your mother back in the 60s, Bea said. Evelyn would bring jars of blackberry preserves. Best preserves in the county, my mother-in-law always said. Dorothy looked at the apples and felt a small ache in her chest, the kind that comes from learning something gentle about a person you loved but never fully knew. I didn't know my mother made preserves, Dorothy said quietly. There's probably a lot about your mother you didn't know, Bea said. She did not mean it unkindly. She said it the way someone says a true thing that they have been holding for a long time, waiting for the right person to give it to. Word traveled fast in Harlow Creek. Within a week, Dorothy noticed people slowing their trucks as they passed the farmhouse, craning their necks to see what the old woman from the city was doing out at the Pruitt place. Some waved. Most just stared. One afternoon, a man appeared at the end of her driveway. He was tall and lean, maybe 70, with sun-darkened skin and a cap pulled low over his eyes. He stood with his hands on his hips, looking at the farmhouse the way a doctor looks at an old patient. "Help you?" Dorothy called from the porch. "Name's Walt Hensley," the man said. "I own the land south of yours. 80 acres of hay and nothing." Dorothy waited. "Your mother and I were neighbors for 30 years, Walt said. She was a private woman. Kept to herself mostly. But she was good people." "Thank you," Dorothy said. Walt shifted his weight. "I don't mean to pry, but that cellar door on the east side of the property. You been down there?" Dorothy felt something tighten in her chest. "Not yet." Walt nodded slowly, as if that was the answer he expected. "Your mother sealed that up herself sometime around 83 or 84. Hired 2 men from the county to pour concrete around the frame and put that padlock on. I remember because I asked her why, and she told me it wasn't my business." He paused. "Only time in 30 years Evelyn Pruitt was ever short with me." Dorothy looked toward the eastern edge of the property where the stone wall disappeared into the bramble. "Did she ever say what was down there?" "No ma'am. And I never asked again." Walt touched the brim of his cap and walked back down the driveway. Dorothy watched him go, then sat down on the porch step and stared at the hill where the sealed door waited behind its wall of thorns. Her mother had sealed it in 83 or 84. That meant it had been shut for over 40 years. But the door itself was older than that. The iron frame, the heavy timber, the construction of the entrance into the hillside, all of it predated Evelyn's ownership by decades. Dorothy had looked at the county records at the post office. The farmhouse had been built in 1921 by a man named Harold Pruitt, Dorothy's grandfather, a man she had never met. He had died in 1945, 1 year after the end of the war, and the property had passed to Evelyn. 1944. The cellar had been sealed since 1944, and then her mother had reinforced that seal 40 years later. 2 generations of silence. 2 deliberate decisions to keep that door shut. And then a note on the back of a deed that said, "For Dorothy, when she is ready." The question that kept Dorothy awake at night was not what was behind the door. It was why her mother had wanted her to find it. 3 weeks after arriving in Harlow Creek, Dorothy received a phone call. She had managed to get the old landline reconnected, and the first time it rang, the sound startled her so badly she nearly dropped the kettle. It was Janine. "Where are you?" Janine's voice was tight and clipped. "The facility called. They said you checked yourself out." "I did," Dorothy said. "Mother, you can't just leave. We had an arrangement." "You had an arrangement," Dorothy said quietly. "I was simply placed." There was a pause on the other end. Dorothy could hear the faint sound of traffic in the background. Janine was probably in her car, calling between appointments. "Where are you staying?" Janine asked. "I'm at a property that belonged to your grandmother." Another pause, longer this time. "What property?" "A farmhouse. South of the city. Your grandmother left it to me." "I've never heard of any farmhouse." "No," Dorothy said. "You haven't." Janine's tone sharpened. "Is it worth anything?" And there it was. The question that always came. Not are you safe, not are you warm, not do you need help. Is it worth anything? Dorothy felt the familiar ache settle behind her ribs, the dull pain of loving someone who measures the world in appraisals. Goodbye, Janine, Dorothy said, and hung up the phone. She stood in the kitchen for a long time after that, one hand resting on the counter, the other pressed flat against her chest. The ceramic bird on the windowsill caught the afternoon light and cast a small shadow across the wall. Dorothy made a decision that evening. She would open the cellar door. Not because she was ready. She was not sure she would ever feel ready. But because the alternative was to sit in this house for whatever years she had left, staring at a sealed door and wondering what her mother had been protecting. And Dorothy was tired of sealed things. Tired of locked rooms and closed conversations and family secrets that outlived the people who kept them. She had spent 20 years in a marriage where important things were never said aloud. She had spent 19 years as a widow carrying questions she could never ask. She was 81 years old, and if there was ever going to be a time to open a door that had been shut for 80 years, it was now. The next morning, Dorothy drove to the hardware store in the next town over and bought a hacksaw, a pry bar, and a heavy-duty flashlight. The man at the register looked at her purchases, then at her, and wisely said nothing. Back at the farmhouse, she spent the better part of 2 hours cutting through the blackberry bramble with a pair of old garden shears she had found in the barn. The thorns tore at her gloves and scratched her forearms, but she worked steadily, clearing the growth away from the door frame one branch at a time until the full entrance was exposed. The door was larger than she had realized. Nearly 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, built from timber planks reinforced with iron straps. The padlock her mother had installed was massive, a commercial-grade lock now so corroded that the keyhole was completely blocked with rust. Concrete had been poured around the base of the frame, sealing the gap between the door and the hillside. Dorothy positioned the hacksaw against the padlock's shackle and began to cut. The metal resisted. Her arms burned after 5 minutes, and she had to stop and rest, sitting on the stone wall with her breath coming in short, visible clouds in the cold morning air. She thought about stopping. She thought about going back inside and making tea and sitting in the rocking chair and letting the door stay sealed for another 40 years. But then she looked at the farmhouse behind her, and she thought about the room at Meadow Glen with its beige walls and its parking lot view, and she picked up the hacksaw again. It took her nearly an hour. When the shackle finally gave way, the padlock fell to the ground with a heavy thud that seemed to echo off the stone wall. Dorothy stood before the door. Her hands were shaking, and not from the cold. She gripped the pry bar and wedged it into the seam between the door and the frame. The concrete her mother had poured cracked and crumbled in pieces. The timber groaned. Dorothy pulled harder, putting her full weight into the bar, and the door shifted. A draft of cold, stale air rushed out from the gap, carrying a smell she did not recognize at first. Old paper. Mineral dust. Something metallic and faintly sweet. She pulled again. The door swung open with a long, low groan that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside the hill. Darkness. Dorothy clicked on the flashlight. The beam cut into the black space and revealed a set of stone steps leading downward. The walls on either side were rough-hewn stone, damp in places, with pale mineral deposits streaking the surface like frozen tears. She descended slowly, one step at a time, keeping one hand on the wall for balance. The staircase was narrow, maybe 12 steps in total, and at the bottom it opened into a room. Dorothy swept the flashlight across the space and stopped breathing. The cellar was larger than she had imagined. Perhaps 20 feet wide and 30 feet deep, with a low vaulted ceiling supported by thick wooden beams. The floor was packed earth, dry and undisturbed. Along the walls, wooden shelving units stood in neat rows, and on those shelves, arranged with careful precision, were dozens of objects that Dorothy's mind struggled to organize into sense. Paintings. Small framed canvases wrapped in oilcloth, stacked upright against the shelves. She counted at least 30. Beside the paintings, rows of small wooden crates, each one sealed with metal clasps and stamped with markings she could not read in the dim light. She moved closer and tilted the flashlight. The stamps were in German. Dorothy's hand trembled. She moved the beam further into the room. Against the far wall, a heavy wooden trunk sat on the floor, its lid secured with a brass latch. Beside the trunk, a stack of leather-bound ledgers, their spines cracked with age. And on a small table in the corner, placed with unmistakable deliberation, was a single envelope. The envelope was yellowed and brittle. On the front, in handwriting Dorothy recognized instantly, her mother had written 3 words. "Read this first." Dorothy set the flashlight on the shelf so it illuminated the room at an angle. She picked up the envelope with both hands and opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, 4 pages long, written in Evelyn Pruitt's precise, unhurried hand. The letter began simply. "My dear Dorothy. If you are reading this, then I am gone and you have found your way to the cellar. I am sorry I could not tell you this while I was alive. I tried many times. But some truths are so heavy that speaking them aloud felt like it would break something that could never be repaired." Dorothy sat down on the edge of the wooden trunk and continued reading. "Your grandfather Harold did not build this cellar for storage. He built it in 1943, during the war, as a receiving point for objects that were being smuggled out of Europe by a network of people who believed that what the Nazis were destroying and stealing should be saved at any cost." Dorothy read the sentence 3 times before its meaning fully settled. Harold was part of a small group of Americans, farmers, tradesmen, and ordinary people, who worked with contacts in France and Belgium to receive and hide cultural artifacts that were being rescued from occupied territories. Paintings taken from Jewish families. Religious manuscripts pulled from churches before they were bombed. Personal documents, photographs, and heirlooms that families entrusted to strangers in the hope that someone, somewhere, would keep them safe until the war ended. Dorothy looked up from the letter. The paintings on the shelves. The crates with German stamps. The ledgers. She looked back down at her mother's handwriting. The war ended, but Harold died before any of it could be returned. He had a heart attack in the field behind the barn in January of 1945. He was 51 years old. After his death, I found the cellar and the records he had kept. Every item is catalogued in the ledgers. Every painting, every document, every object has a name attached to it. The name of the family it belonged to. Dorothy turned the page. Her hands were no longer shaking. They were perfectly still. "I was 23 years old when I found this room. I did not know what to do. The war was over, but the world was still broken, and I was a young woman alone on a farm with no idea who to trust. So I sealed the cellar and I kept the secret. I told myself I would deal with it when I was older, when I was wiser, when I understood enough to do the right thing." The next line was written in ink that was slightly darker, as if Evelyn had paused and come back to the letter later. "I never did. And that is my greatest shame. These objects do not belong to me. They never did. They belong to the families whose names are written in the ledgers. I have carried this weight for over 40 years, and now I am giving it to you. Not as a burden, Dorothy, but as a purpose. Find the families. Return what was taken. Do what I could not." Dorothy set the letter down on her lap. The flashlight hummed softly on the shelf. The cellar was silent around her, the kind of silence that has substance, that presses against your skin and asks you to be still. She sat there for a very long time. Then she picked up the nearest ledger and opened it. The first page was dated March 17, 1944. In her grandfather's handwriting, a list of items received, each one followed by a name and a city. Oil painting, portrait of a woman, and signed. Belonged to the Feldman family. Lyon, France. Wooden Torah case, hand-carved. Belonged to the Rosenberg family. Antwerp, Belgium. 7 silver candlesticks, hallmarked. Belonged to the Hirsch family. Amsterdam. Dorothy turned page after page. There were hundreds of entries. Hundreds of names. Hundreds of families who had handed their most precious possessions to strangers and hoped. She closed the ledger and pressed it against her chest. Above her, through the stone ceiling, she could hear the wind moving through the trees. The farmhouse creaked softly, the way old houses do when they are settling into the night. Dorothy climbed the stone steps slowly, carrying the ledger and her mother's letter. When she reached the top, she stood in the open doorway and looked back down into the darkness. For 80 years, this room had been sealed. For 80 years, these objects had waited in the dark for someone to come and do what should have been done generations ago. Dorothy Calloway was 81 years old. She had been dismissed by her children, removed from her home, and placed in a room with beige walls and a view of a parking lot. The world had decided she was finished. But standing at the threshold of that cellar, holding a ledger full of names that had waited 80 years to be spoken aloud, Dorothy understood something with a clarity that made her chest ache. She was not finished. She was just beginning. Dorothy did not sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her and her mother's letter beside it, reading entry after entry by the glow of the overhead light. The handwriting shifted between pages, sometimes steady and deliberate, sometimes hurried, as if Harold had been writing in the dark or between interruptions. Each entry followed the same careful format. A description of the object, the name of the family it belonged to, the city or town they had come from, and occasionally a short note in the margin. Things like delivered by R through Montreal or received in damaged condition, wrapped in newspaper dated June 1943. By the time pale light began creeping through the kitchen window, Dorothy had counted 312 individual entries spanning from March of 1943 to November of 1944. 312 objects. 312 families. The scope of what her grandfather had done, quietly, from a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, was almost impossible to comprehend. She closed the ledger and pressed her palms flat against the table. Her body ached from sitting all night, but her mind was sharp and clear. She knew she could not do this alone. Whatever was in that cellar, whatever those paintings and crates and documents truly were, she needed someone who understood what they were looking at. Someone who could tell her whether what she had found was what her mother's letter claimed it to be. The next morning, Dorothy drove to the Harlow Creek post office and used the public computer to search for something she had never searched for before. She typed the words "Stolen Art World War II Restitution" and pressed enter. What came back was a world she had never known existed. Databases of lost and looted artwork. International commissions dedicated to returning cultural property stolen during the Holocaust. University departments, museum programs, legal organizations, all devoted to identifying and tracing objects that had been taken from Jewish families, from churches, from libraries, from entire communities that had been erased. Dorothy sat at the small desk in the post office for over 2 hours, reading. She wrote down 3 names and 3 phone numbers on a slip of paper, then drove home. The first call she made was to a professor named Dr. Rebecca Stein at a university in Washington, D.C. Dr. Stein's faculty page described her as a specialist in provenance research and wartime cultural recovery. Dorothy dialed the number with steady hands and waited. A woman answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was warm but professional. Dorothy introduced herself and explained, as simply as she could, what she had found. A sealed cellar beneath a farmhouse in rural America. Paintings wrapped in oilcloth. Crates with German markings. Ledgers with names and cities. A letter from her mother explaining that her grandfather had been part of a network smuggling cultural artifacts out of occupied Europe during the war. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Calloway," Dr. Stein said carefully. "Do you understand what you might be describing?" "I believe I do," Dorothy said. "Can you read me one of the ledger entries?" "Exactly as it's written?" Dorothy opened the ledger to the first page. Oil painting, portrait of a woman, and signed. Belonged to the Feldman family. Lyon, France. Received April 2, 1943. Delivered by R through Montreal. She heard Dr. Stein's breath catch. Then the sound of a chair being pushed back. "Mrs. Calloway, I need you to not touch anything else in that cellar." "Can you do that for me?" "Yes. I'm going to make some calls." I may need to come see this myself. Would that be all right? That would be more than all right, Dorothy said. Dr. Stein arrived 11 days later. She did not come alone. With her was a colleague from the National Archives, a man named Dr. Paul Weiss, and a young woman named Clara who carried camera equipment and white cotton gloves in a metal case. They drove up the gravel driveway in a rented SUV, and when they stepped out, all three of them stood for a moment looking at the farmhouse with the kind of expression people wear when they are standing at the edge of something they have spent their careers searching for. Dorothy met them on the porch. She had made coffee and set out cups on the kitchen table, because that is what you do when people come to your home, even when those people are about to walk into a room that has been sealed for 80 years. Dr. Stein shook Dorothy's hand with both of hers. "Thank you for calling me," she said. "You have no idea how rare this is." Dorothy led them around the side of the house to the stone wall and the open cellar door. The bramble she had cleared was already beginning to creep back, but the entrance was still exposed. The stone steps descended into darkness. Dr. Stein went down first, flashlight in one hand, the other trailing along the damp wall. Dorothy heard her reach the bottom and then heard nothing for several seconds. "Oh my God," Dr. Stein said quietly. Dr. Weiss followed. Then Clara with her camera. Dorothy came last, descending the steps she had climbed only once before, and found the three of them standing in the center of the cellar, turning in slow circles, their flashlights sweeping across the shelves. Dr. Stein was already at the paintings. She had pulled on white gloves and was carefully lifting the oilcloth from the nearest canvas. Beneath the wrapping was a small oil portrait of a young woman in a blue dress, seated beside a window. The brushwork was delicate, the colors still vivid despite decades in the dark. "This is consistent with early 20th century European portraiture," Dr. Stein said, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned the canvas over. On the back, in pencil, someone had written a name and a date. Feldman. Lyon. 1938. She looked at Dorothy. "This matches your grandfather's ledger." Dr. Weiss had opened one of the crates. Inside, wrapped in layers of newspaper dated 1943, were 7 silver candlesticks, each one tarnished but intact, each one bearing the hallmark of a Dutch silversmith. He checked the ledger entry. "Hirsch family. Amsterdam." Clara photographed everything. Every shelf, every crate, every object. The shutter clicked steadily in the quiet room, and with each click, something that had been hidden for 80 years was brought into the light. Over the next 3 days, Dr. Stein and her team catalogued the contents of the cellar. They worked methodically, moving from shelf to shelf, crate to crate, matching each object against Harold Pruitt's ledger entries. The correlation was extraordinary. Nearly every item in the cellar corresponded to an entry in the ledger. Names, dates, cities, descriptions. Harold had been meticulous. In total, the cellar contained 37 paintings, including 2 that Dr. Stein believed might be the work of known European masters whose catalogues had gaps from the war years. There were over 100 personal documents, letters, family photographs, identity papers, and religious texts. There were 63 pieces of silver and metalwork, including Sabbath candlesticks, Kiddush cups, and ornamental pieces. There were 14 hand-carved wooden objects, including the Torah case from Antwerp. And in the heavy wooden trunk where Dorothy had sat while reading her mother's letter, wrapped in a velvet cloth that had preserved it almost perfectly, was a 17th-century illuminated manuscript, its pages painted with gold leaf and deep blue pigment, its binding still intact. Dr. Weiss held the manuscript in his gloved hands and did not speak for nearly a minute. When he finally looked up at Dorothy, his eyes were wet. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "This is one of the most significant private recoveries of looted cultural property I have ever seen." Dorothy stood quietly at the edge of the room, watching the experts handle objects that her grandfather had carried into this cellar by hand, one at a time, in the middle of a war. She thought of Harold Pruitt, a farmer in rural America, building a secret room in a hillside and filling it with the sacred possessions of families he would never meet, preserving them against a destruction he could not stop but refused to accept. She thought of her mother, 23 years old, discovering this room after her father's death and sealing it shut because she did not know what else to do. Carrying the weight of it for 40 years. Writing a letter she hoped her daughter would one day read. And she thought of herself. 81 years old. Dismissed. Discarded. Placed in a room with beige walls by her own children because they had decided she was no longer useful. Standing in that cellar, surrounded by the rescued remnants of families who had lost everything, Dorothy understood something that settled into her bones like warmth after a long cold. She had been given this. Not the objects. Not their value. But the task. The purpose of returning what had been taken. That was the inheritance her mother had left her. Not money. Not property. A reason to keep going. Dr. Stein contacted the International Commission for Looted Art in Europe. Within 2 weeks, a team of provenance researchers began cross-referencing Harold Pruitt's ledger entries against international databases of art and cultural property reported stolen or missing during the Second World War. The matches came back quickly. Families in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Poland, and Austria. Some of the family names in the ledger corresponded to descendants who were still alive, still searching, still holding on to the hope that what their grandparents and great-grandparents had lost might one day be found. The first confirmation came from a family in Lyon. The Feldman portrait, the small oil painting of a young woman in a blue dress, had been reported missing in 1942. The family's granddaughter, a woman named Miriam Feldman Roche, was 74 years old and living in Paris. When she was told that the painting had been found in a cellar in rural America, she wept so hard she could not finish the phone call. Dorothy was there when the call was made. Dr. Stein had put it on speaker so that the translation could be managed. Dorothy did not understand the French, but she understood the sound. The sound of someone being given back a piece of the life that had been stolen from their family 3 generations ago. Dorothy pressed her hand to her mouth and closed her eyes. That was the moment she knew she had done the right thing. The story reached the regional newspaper first. Then a wire service picked it up. Within a month, the farmhouse in Harlow Creek had been visited by journalists from 4 countries. Cameras lined the gravel driveway. Reporters stood in front of the stone wall where the cellar door had been hidden for decades, speaking into microphones in English, French, German, and Dutch. Dorothy did not seek the attention. She did not give interviews willingly. When a television crew from Chicago asked to film inside the cellar, she agreed only on the condition that they focus on the objects and the families they belong to, not on her. "This is not my story," she told the producer quietly. "It belongs to the people whose names are in that ledger." But of course, the story did belong to her, whether she wanted it to or not. An 81-year-old woman, removed from her home by her own children and placed in an assisted living facility, who had walked away with nothing and found a sealed cellar containing one of the most significant collections of recovered wartime cultural property in American history. The narrative was too powerful to ignore. Janine called on a Tuesday afternoon. Dorothy was sitting on the porch, watching a pair of deer graze at the edge of the meadow, when the phone rang. She let it ring 4 times before answering. "Mom." Janine's voice was different. The sharp edges had been sanded down, replaced by something thinner, more careful. "I saw the news." Dorothy said nothing. "Is it true? All of it?" "Yes." A long pause. Dorothy could hear Janine breathing. "The house on Maple Ridge," Janine said. "The sale went through. Martin and I split it." "I know," Dorothy said. "Mom, if I had known about this place, about what was down there, I never would have." "Would never have what, Janine?" Dorothy's voice was not angry. It was simply clear. "Would never have put me in that facility? Would never have sold my home? Would never have treated me like an inconvenience?" Silence. "You didn't need to know about the cellar to treat me with dignity," Dorothy said. "That should have come without conditions." She heard Janine make a small sound, something between a breath and a word that never formed. Then the line went quiet for a long time. "Can I come see you?" Janine asked. Dorothy looked out across the meadow. The deer had lifted their heads, ears turning towards some distant sound. "Not yet," Dorothy said. "I have work to do." She hung up and sat on the porch until the sun touched the tops of the pine trees. Then she went inside and opened the ledger to the next page. Martin came without calling first. He drove up the gravel driveway 3 weeks after Janine's phone call, parked his car beside the old pickup truck, and sat behind the wheel for a full 5 minutes before getting out. Dorothy watched him from the kitchen window. He looked smaller than she remembered. His shoulders were hunched, and he walked slowly up the porch steps like a man approaching a door he was not sure he had the right to knock on. Dorothy opened the door before he could. Martin looked at her. His eyes were red and his jaw was tight, the way it always got when he was trying not to feel something. He had done that since he was a boy. Held everything behind his teeth like a secret. "Mom," he said. "I'm sorry." Dorothy studied her son. He was 49 years old. He had stood in her kitchen and let his sister dismantle her life without saying a word. He had not called her back. He had not visited. He had let the silence do his work for him, and silence, Dorothy knew, was its own kind of cruelty. But he was her son. And he was standing on her porch with his hands hanging at his sides and his eyes full of the kind of shame that cannot be performed. "Come inside," she said. They sat at the kitchen table. Dorothy made tea. Martin held the cup but did not drink. He stared at the ledger sitting on the counter, at the photographs Dr. Stein had left behind, at the farmhouse kitchen that his mother had cleaned and repaired and made her own with nothing but time and stubbornness. "I didn't know," he said. "You didn't want to know," Dorothy said gently. "There's a difference." Martin flinched. Not from anger, but from recognition. The recognition that the woman sitting across from him had always been stronger than the world had given her credit for, and that he had been part of the world that failed to see it. "What are you going to do with it all?" he asked. "Return it," Dorothy said. "Every piece. Every painting, every document, every candlestick. It goes back to the families it belongs to." Martin looked at her. "All of it?" "All of it." He was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded slowly and set his cup down. "Can I help?" he asked. Dorothy looked at her son. The boy who had once slept on the living room couch with one arm hanging over the side. The man who had let her down in the worst way a child can let down a parent. But also the man who had driven 4.5 hours down a gravel road to sit at her table and ask if he could help. "Yes," she said. "You can." Over the following months, Dorothy worked with Dr. Stein's team, the International Commission, and a growing network of provenance researchers to begin the process of restitution. It was painstaking work. Some families were easy to locate. Others had been scattered by the war, their descendants spread across continents, their names changed, their records incomplete. But Harold's ledgers were remarkably detailed, and one by one, the connections were made. The Hirsch family's silver candlesticks were returned to a great-granddaughter living in Amsterdam. She flew to Harlow Creek to receive them in person and stood in Dorothy's kitchen holding the candlesticks her great-grandmother had polished every Friday evening before the war. A collection of family photographs belonging to the Weiss family of Vienna was returned to a grandson living in Melbourne, Australia. He had never seen his grandparents' faces before. When the package arrived, he called Dorothy and spoke in halting English. "You have given me my family," he said. "I did not have them before today." The Torah case from Antwerp was returned to the Rosenberg family. The great-grandson, a man named David Rosenberg, traveled from Brussels to Harlow Creek to receive it himself. He was a tall, quiet man in his 50s, and when Dorothy placed the carved wooden case in his hands, he held it the way a person holds something that has come back from the dead. He turned it over slowly, running his fingers along the carvings his great-grandfather had made by hand nearly a century ago. Then he looked at Dorothy and said, in a voice so steady it barely held together, "My grandmother told me about this case every night before bed. She said it was the most beautiful thing her father ever made. She died believing it was destroyed." He paused. "I will tell her she was wrong." Dorothy walked him to his car that evening. Before he drove away, he turned back and said, "Mrs. Calloway, you did not just return a piece of wood. You returned a man's hands. His work. The proof that he existed." Dorothy stood in the driveway long after the taillights disappeared down the gravel road. The illuminated manuscript was authenticated by a team at a European museum as a work of extraordinary historical and cultural significance. Its provenance was traced to a synagogue in southern Poland that had been destroyed in 1942. The manuscript was valued at several $1 million. Dorothy donated it to the museum on the condition that it be displayed with a plaque bearing the name of the congregation it had belonged to and the name of Harold Pruitt, the farmer who had kept it safe. She did not keep a single object for herself. Not one painting, not one silver cup, not one faded photograph. Every item in the cellar was returned or placed in the care of an institution dedicated to preserving the memory of what had been lost. When reporters asked her why she did not keep any of it, Dorothy's answer was simple. "It was never mine to keep." Walt Hensley came by the farmhouse on a cool evening in late autumn. He brought a bottle of cider and 2 glasses and sat with Dorothy on the porch while the sun went down behind the mountains. The fields had turned golden copper, and the air smelled like wood smoke and fallen leaves. "Your mother would be proud," Walt said. Dorothy rocked slowly in the chair she had brought out from the front room. The same chair Evelyn had rocked in. The same chair that had creaked beneath Dorothy the first night she arrived. "She carried this for 40 years, Dorothy said. "I wish she had told me sooner." "Maybe she needed you to be ready," Walt said. Dorothy considered that. Ready. Her mother's word. Written on the back of a deed in careful handwriting. For Dorothy, when she is ready. Maybe Evelyn had known something Dorothy herself had not understood until she was 81 years old and sitting in a room with beige walls and a view of a parking lot. Maybe readiness was not about age or strength or wisdom. Maybe it was about being stripped down to nothing, to the very last thing you have, and discovering that the last thing you have is enough. The cellar door stood open now. Dorothy had asked Walt to help her build a simple wooden frame around the entrance to keep the rain out, but she had insisted the door itself remain unsealed. No more locks. No more secrets. The stone steps leading down into the hillside were visible from the path behind the house, and anyone who walked the property could see the entrance clearly. It was an empty room now. The shelves were bare. The crates were gone. The trunk had been shipped to a museum in Washington. The ledgers were being preserved by the National Archives. All that remained was the stone chamber itself, cool and quiet, with the faint smell of mineral dust and old timber. Dorothy went down there sometimes in the evenings. She would sit on the bottom step and listen to the silence. Not the heavy silence of a secret kept too long, but the lighter silence of a room that had finally fulfilled its purpose. She thought about Harold, building these walls by hand in 1943. She thought about the strangers in Europe who had wrapped their most precious possessions in cloth and newspaper and handed them to a network of people they would never meet, trusting that someone, somewhere, on the other side of an ocean and a war, would keep them safe. She thought about her mother, young and alone, standing in this room and making the only decision she knew how to make. And she thought about herself. 81 years old. Her children had sold her home and placed her in a facility. The world had decided she was finished. And instead, she had opened a door that had been sealed for 80 years and returned 312 pieces of stolen life to the families they belonged to. Dorothy climbed the steps slowly and walked back to the farmhouse. The kitchen light was on. Martin's car was in the driveway. He had started coming on weekends, helping her with the property, fixing the things that needed fixing. They did not talk about Meadow Glen. They did not talk about the house on Maple Ridge Lane. They talked about the work that was in front of them, and slowly, carefully, they began to talk about other things too. Janine had not come yet. Dorothy did not know if she would. But she had left the door open, the way she left all doors open now. On the mantel above the fireplace, the small ceramic bird sat in its usual place, catching the light from the window the way it always had. Beside it, Dorothy had placed a single photograph. It was a picture of Evelyn Pruitt, standing in front of the farmhouse in 1951, young and serious, with one hand resting on the stone wall. Dorothy touched the frame gently as she passed. "I was ready, Mama," she said quietly. "I just needed a little push." She sat down in the rocking chair and pulled Frank's old cardigan around her shoulders. Outside, the wind moved through the whispering pines and the last light of the day stretched across the fields in long golden lines. The farmhouse creaked softly around her, settling into the evening the way it had settled into every evening for over 100 years. The cellar was empty now. The door was open. The names in the ledger had been spoken aloud after 80 years of silence. And Dorothy Calloway, 81 years old, was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because the world had placed her here, but because she had chosen it. And maybe that is the quiet truth this story leaves behind. That the things we seal away do not disappear. They wait. They wait in dark rooms and locked cellars and forgotten farmhouses at the end of dirt roads. They wait for someone brave enough or desperate enough or old enough to finally turn the key. And when that person comes, when the door finally opens, what spills out is not just what was hidden. It is the proof that nothing is ever truly lost as long as someone is willing to look for it. Thank you so much for staying until the very end. Stories like this one remind us that the most important doors haven't been opened yet. If this moved you, there are more stories waiting for you on your screen right now. And if you haven't subscribed